Hi friends, welcome to this latest podcast of the Nationalist View, and today we have with us a very special guest, Mr. Sam Westrop. Mr. Westrop, thank you so much for taking time out from your busy schedule and being with us. Mr. Westrop, let me just briefly introduce him. He is currently Director, Islamist Watch at Middle East Forum. Middle East Forum is a prominent US-based global think tank, and before that, he ran Stand for Peace, a London-based counter-extremism organization monitoring Islamists throughout the United Kingdom. What we're going to talk about is basically a report which was driven primarily by Mr. Sam Westrop, and which was published in Middle East Forum recently. And that report was on USAID, an organization that has funneled apparently millions of dollars to radical and terrorist organizations in the name of humanitarian aid. This expose was done with an extensive research done by Mr. Westrop and his colleagues for over a period of 2 years. And we have seen the Trump administration taking very strong action on this report. In fact, it has made global headlines. So, Mr. Westrop, first, I want to congratulate you and your colleagues for such phenomenal work. And
Thank you very much, and thank you
yeah,
for
and
having me on.
my first question is, sir, uh, I want to start with, currently, what is the status of now? One of your colleagues has gone and he has also given a briefing to the Congress during a congressional hearing. And so, what exactly is the status of US aid right now? Whether it has been dismantled, is it under the process of getting dismantled, or is it getting restructured in wake of the report which Middle East Forum had done under your leadership?
Well, the Trump administration appears to be moving forward with plans to formally abolish it. There are certain congressional requirements and subsistence level activities that what remains of USAID has to be carrying out. So I believe at the moment the Trump administration is moving towards maintaining it with a staff of just a dozen people, maybe 15 people. But yes, the aim is to abolish it. And the idea is that a lot of the functions of USAID, everything from the funding to the role of USAID as a soft power organization, will now be subsumed by its parent organization, the Department of State, the State Department. This is problematic for us for exactly the same reasons we thought USAID was problematic, is that both have a habit of funding some bad people. So yeah, the future of USAID looks in doubt. Whether this means improvements, whether this means the federal government now stops funding radicals around the world, well, I don't believe that. I think we're masking the problem. We're shuffling the cards around without dealing with the underlying issue.
So I would come to my next question, but just want you to elaborate upon this thing. There's a very interesting thing which you have said that, uh, you know, despite, such strong action being visibly taken against the US aid, so is it merely optics? But you said, that we are in US, like it's basically they're kind of just masking the problem. And it seems that the root cause of the problem is not being addressed. So if you could, elaborate a little bit upon this thing for our viewers.
So what our report looked at was $164 million of funding from both USAID and the State Department to radical forces around the world. 122 million of that 164 went to groups that we can show are aligned with violent extremists, with terrorist organizations. This not only is more than just a USAID, it also includes state. This is not the rest of the federal government. The rest of the federal government is busy funding many problematic organizations as well. Because the rest of the federal government is inwards looking, these other radical organizations tend to be domestic, not overseas groups. But the point we're trying to make, and one we've been trying to make for almost 10 years, is that the federal government cannot be trusted to choose the right partners and contractors and vendors, especially within Muslim communities. They invariably pick Islamists. They pick the radicals who step forward and say, yes, give us money, we represent the Muslim community. Whether they do or don't, the US government believes them. And more often than not, the US government is funding Islamists, extremists, who have taken charge of Muslim communities and either route that money towards ideological advancement of Islamism or worse, to welfare fronts for terrorism. So the federal government as a whole doesn't get it. So when something like USAID is shut down, we're pleased to see a major donor to Islamism around the world meet a grisly fate. What we're less pleased about is that now all the bad things USAID did may now just continue under State Department. And there will perhaps be less inclination from the Trump administration to clamp down on State Department activities because they've heralded this as the solution to the problem of USAID. So our worry is that by shutting USAID down without substantively addressing the underlying issue of Islamism, the US government has just made it more murky. They've just made it more possible to fund Islamism without the public noticing, without the media noticing, without Congress noting. What this problem requires is transparency, is sunlight. We want to be able to see what the government is funding. We want them to know that the government is more seriously and thoughtfully considering what it's funding, and merely shuffling grants around from one department to another probably won't solve the issue.
Now I want to come to specifically two aspects in the report. If you could talk a little bit in detail about that. One is how the US aid funding went to Hamas. And the second one is basically the US aid funding going to especially terrorist groups directly or indirectly, probably. No, most of the time it was indirectly through some frontal organizations in South Asia, especially Pakistan, like groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba.
Yeah. So I stress the report only deals with those grants we know about, and we focused on grants that move through a domestic grantee primarily. So the data I'm about to give you may be just a small amount of the total problem. But yes, I mentioned we found $122 million of USAID and state monies going to groups aligned with terror. In the Gaza Strip, this included charities such as Islamic Relief, very major Muslim Brotherhood charity founded in the UK. In Gaza, it works very closely with proxies for Hamas, the terrorist organization. Similarly, another group, American Near East Refugee Aid, was authorized with tens of millions of dollars of USAID funds. We don't exactly know how much it got, thanks to incomplete federal records. But again, this group, the American Near East Refugee Aid, or ANERA, also openly worked with Hamas charitable fronts. Its staff in Gaza openly expressed support for violence against Jews, support of Hamas resistance, and so on. And this is how places like Gaza operate, areas where terrorists control the local polity. Welfare is very key, is pivotal to how these terrorist groups operate. And it has been since the beginning, really, of the 20th century. If you look at groups like Muslim Brotherhood themselves, in fact, in Egypt, where they emerged, they operated by setting up charitable initiatives. If you look at Al-Qaeda in Mali in about 10 years ago, they not only engaged in horrifying violence, but they also set up low-cost prescription drug programs. And indeed, for anyone of your watchers who follows Islamism in Kashmir, you'll know that charity is very key to the way that terrorist groups there operate. Yes, welfare is seen as a key part of violent extremism because charity allows you to hide money, raise money, recruit, because you help create lawful infrastructure for recruitment, and also legitimizes you. It legitimizes you in the eyes of the people that you're trying to control. So the people of Gaza have been made dependent on Hamas because of all the charitable programs that Hamas set up. And these charities in the West, Islamist or not, as well as their government funders, serve to finance that charitable infrastructure. So this is an enormous industry, and Hamas benefits both directly and indirectly from USAID monies routed through Western charities, which in turn knowingly and unknowingly work with Hamas proxies. The exact same a problem is evident in South Asia. In the case of the USA grant that went to one group, a group called Helping Hand for Relief and Development, this organization is an affiliate of Jamaat-e-Islami, the South Asian cousin of the Muslim Brotherhood, which I'm sure you and many of your listeners will be aware. And it's very, very powerful network in the United States, but it maintains very close links with Pakistan and so on. However, in this case, HHRD, it not only works with violent Jamaat-e-Islami groups in South Asia, it also, a few years ago, we found was partnering with Lashkar-e-Taiba, the group responsible for the 2008 Mumbai attacks. And it worked with this group, despite this group being already designated by the US government. Despite this information that this group, this Helping Hand for Relief and Development, had partnered with a Lashkar-e-Taiba proxy, USAID gave it money. And it gave it money after Congress reached out at our encouragement to USAID to say, hey, stop, you are funding a group that is partnering with Lashkar-e-Taiba. USAID went ahead and funded them anyway. So this raises questions about how, to what extent is USAID's behavior guileless, naive, foolish, and to what extent is it knowingly engaging in the financing of radical groups? And it certainly looks, in that case of Helping Hand for Relief and Development, it certainly looks that the USAID knew more than we initially thought, and was perhaps a little more complicit than we initially thought.
So I also want to touch upon this thing because you have been, tracking the Islamists. Initially in UK and then across the world and their actions. Is it just tip of the iceberg what you have unearthed so far? Is there much more?
Yeah, I think so. The amount of total federal funding I estimate to be around $500 million going to Islamist groups, so at least 2-3 times the USAID amount in total across the federal government. Then in the US, there's state and funding as well, city funding. That adds up to many hundreds of millions of more. And this money is going, yes, to these humanitarian aid charities controlled by Islamists, but also very powerful industries of domestic Islamist networks controlling mosques and schools. The great illusion of the US is that it maintains a purely secular state, that religious organizations don't get taxpayers' money, don't get government money. That is not true. Religious organizations in the United States receive tens and tens of billions of dollars from the US government and from state government as well. And it's moved through everything from school lunch voucher programs to direct grants from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Agriculture, Department of Education. All these things move money into religious organizations. So the amount that Islamists are getting is in some ways unknowable. We'll never be able to count it all. It's an enormous amount. States and cities are not transparent with their spending records in the way that the federal government is. And indeed, where the federal government is transparent with its spending records, we often find that those records are anything but transparent and often filled with mistakes or duplications or other questionable elements to their data. So, it is tip of the iceberg. I wish I had a total figure for you about how much Islamists were getting from all branches of the US government and state governments, but I don't. I just know it's a lot, at least $1 billion, probably much more. In Europe, the problem is much the same. The UK government is a prolific funder of Islamism, as is the European Union, other European national governments. However, European governments over the last 10 years have begun to realize why this is such a dangerous approach. And funding has reduced quite noticeably to a number of groups, not everywhere, however. All in all, I would say there still remains a very significant failing on behalf of polities in the West to understand the sheer reliance that radicals have on the US, on Western taxpayers, on Western governments for their financial success and for their control of communities. And as soon as you cut off government funding completely, a lot of Islamist groups would fail. And moderate Muslims within Muslim communities might have a slightly better chance of regaining their communities, recapturing their communities from Islamist control.
I also wanted to ask you about your insight on, because you worked on this report for so long along with your colleagues. Do you see a connect between organizations like Hamas and Lashkar-e-Taiba in terms of, the parent charities, the same pattern, the same kind of funding pattern? Of course, ideologically, they are on the same ground, but did you also see any logistic connect between this thing that they are part of a wider global terror or global Islamist network, which is working in
Well,
tandem with each other?
I mean, what tends to unite, what tends to unite something? I mean, ideologically, yes, as you point out, Lashkar-e-Taiba and Hamas, both Islamists, both Sunni Islamists, but on that Sunni Islamist spectrum, they're quite far apart. Lashkar-e-Taiba has, theological roots rather different to Hamas. I can't imagine they spend much time in each other's company. That said, what unites them is actually often their Western supporters. So Helping Hand for Relief and Development, yes, partnered with Lashkar-e-Taiba, it also funds a group in South Asia called Al-Khidmat. And Al-Khidmat, in turn, overtly funds Hamas. Al-Khidmat is Jamaat-e-Islami. Similarly, when the head of Lashkar-e-Taiba, Hafiz Saeed, when his brother was an imam in the United States, he was operating in a mosque just outside Boston. His mosque would often work with charities that we now know are aligned with Hamas and Gaza. So it's actually the thing that unites them, I feel, most of all, is yes, the infrastructure set up to support them in the West. Their Sunni Islamist supporters in places like the United States don't mind that these two terrorist groups have somewhat different objectives, somewhat different theological roots. They regard them, as arguably they regard them as both important manifestations of the Islamist cause from the Western perspective. So, yeah, no, they're certainly connected. In terms of direct contact, direct coordination, you might want to speak to a Lashkar-e-Taiba expert. It's a little outside my realm of expertise, but it's a very interesting question, certainly.
Uh, uh, One more thing which I wanted to ask, sir, now going way ahead, you said, greater transparency and, procedural checks and balances. So these are required. So these kind of things are basically not repeated again. But how easier it is said than done, given the kind of fractured polity in the United States right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to see anyone in Congress overtly opposing transparency, but they do. They'll argue it has unknown or hidden negative effects. And the transparency that we're advocating for is pretty strong. We want any organization applying for US government funds to have their vetting documents and review by government published. We think that should be a public document because we think government should solicit public submissions on the suitability of the organizations they fund. We think that's a reasonable request. I can imagine a lot of organizations, especially those that rely heavily on the federal government for money, being very upset by those requirements. And undoubtedly they would retain congressional supporters to argue their case. So, yeah, no, I can imagine a lot of political opposition in practice, even if on paper, in theory, they say they support transparency. I imagine they would be against. Other things we're asking for are any non-profit organization that receives government money, we believe, should be publishing unredacted copies of their tax returns, including details of local partners in foreign conflict zones, full details of their contributors, and so on. Again, you can imagine a lot of groups being very unhappy about forced to sort of open their balance book, their accounts to outside scrutiny. But again, we think if you're to be trusted with public money, you should submit yourself to that kind of scrutiny. So yes, I imagine this will be an uphill battle in Congress. We are working already on some measures with some congressional officers, and we hope to see some good results in the first Trump administration. That may all change in 2 years' time when we have the midterms, and if the Republicans lose the House, then things will presumably get a lot more difficult. But there are plenty of Democrats who see the problem as well, and will be likely to, hopefully, will want to work with us. And given the radical nature of the overhaul we think is necessary, who knows where we'll find allies and enemies in this current political climate.
Thank you, Mr. Westrop. I think we'll end the conversation here for the time being. And thank you to the viewers for watching. And thank you so much, Mr. Westrop, for taking again time out from your busy schedule and being with us and sharing such deep insights. And if our viewers have any questions, they can post it in the YouTube comment box, and we'll try and take them to Mr. Westrop and get answers for them. And again, best of luck, Mr. Westrop, for your forthcoming projects which can counter Islamism. And to our viewers, thank you for watching. We'll be back soon with another episode. Thank you so much.